Welcome to this episode of Rebecca Sounds Reveille. I am so excited today to talk to you about something that many people either may not know about, or they may have sort of thought, well, that's kind of a weird thing. I'm not so sure if I really want to get involved with that. But I'm going to tell you, based on the research that I've done over the last couple of years, it is something that's very, very successful. And today we're going to be talking about what EFT is all about. Now, I certainly could tell you what that stands for, but the guest that we have with us is an expert in this field, and it is better for him to share it with you. He is an award-winning author whose best-selling book, The Genie in Your Genius, The Genie in Your Genes, it has had some absolutely incredible reviews because of the breakthroughs in the link between emotions and genetics. This is enormous, and it is something that we really need to pay a whole lot of attention to. And he founded the National Institute of Integrative Healthcare, and there's a whole lot more to this. And I will let him elaborate on that because this is something that is crucial into his work. And in addition to that, this research that he has done and the things that he has uncovered has been published in very prestigious scientific journals. And he's also the editor of Energy Psychology, Theory, Research, and Treatment. Let's see, he is a blogger for the Huffington Post. He has a peer-reviewed professional journal. There is so much to what he is going to share with us today that I think is going to be extremely beneficial, not only to you, but maybe to somebody that you know. We're also going to talk about his new book, and I will let him introduce that to you as well. With us today is Dr. Dawson Church. Welcome.
Rebecca, it's so good to be here, and what's the common thread there is a passion for healing, which I know we both share, so I look forward to exploring that together.
Yes, and I love it. It's something that I have found that has been very interesting in the healing process is that many people don't know where to turn. They know that there's an issue that needs to be addressed, but the resources either just aren't there, or they think the practice of some of them is just a little bit too out there for them. However, over time, we're finding that so many natural methods are very healing to us, or some things that are so simplified, and we don't need to be turning to the pharmaceutical industry to treat symptoms. We can actually find and resolve issues that are going on within us, and it takes us a little bit on our part to get educated on what those types of resources are. Now, a few years ago, I will tell you, I was looking into some things regarding military veterans and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I found something very interesting, and that was that there was something called EFT that was being used and was very successful in the treatment of PTSD. And so for the audience who may not know what EFT is, can you tell us what that is and a little bit more about it?
Sure. And you're right. It's been used very successfully in several randomized controlled trials with veterans, veterans of Vietnam, a few veterans of World War II and Korea, veterans of the recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it shows, all the research shows that EFT, when used for PTSD, is incredibly successful. People's symptoms like flashbacks and nightmares, intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, all those symptoms go down by an average of 65% in those clinical trials. So we've shown over and over and over again in research published in peer-reviewed journals that EFT is really effective for PTSD. It's a very simple method. What you do is you think about stuff that bothers you, and then we use acupressure and we combine it with those thoughts. So if you think about something that bothers you, just for example, if you're a veteran having a flashback or a nightmare, then you are thinking about those thoughts, your whole body's responding, your stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are really shoot up when you have those thoughts. And so the normal cycle of human experience is we have traumatic experiences, and then we don't want to think about them afterwards. We want to push them out of our minds. We want to think positively, get over it, and move on. But that's not the way it works. There was a giant study done by the Centers for Disease Control of 17,400 adults, and it showed people with a highly traumatized childhood, lots of trauma in their childhood, that they had very high rates of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and all kinds of other physical diseases. And that was in their 50s. So 50 years later, untreated childhood trauma results in much higher levels of disease. And people who are highly traumatized, they die on average about something like 14 years earlier than non-traumatized people. So it really affects people in terms of their health long term. Mm-hmm. So EFT, you have the bad stuff happen to you. We all have bad stuff happen to us. I mean, we aren't all, beaten or miserably abused when we're children, but we may have neglect, we may have a lack of attention, and even those kinds of challenges can really be setbacks for us. So the usual response is try and think positively, go read some books, take a meditation course, have some therapy, and so on. And what EFT does is paradoxically is have you actually think about those. So in all of our veterans trials, veterans actually make lists and walk in the front door of the therapist's office the very first day with a list of all the bad things that happened to them. And they talk about those things. And then the magic ingredient is we use acupressure. And that's simply rubbing or tapping on 12 acupuncture points. And when you think about the bad stuff and you tap, we find that people's levels of triggering go way down. So, for example, one Vietnam veteran had a terrible story he told to his therapist about how his best friend was killed one day in Vietnam. And for 40 years, he'd been haunted by this picture because every day he and his best friend would go out on patrol together. And so each day they'd shoulder their rifles, put on their helmets, and they'd leave the base and go on patrol together. And he was always on the right, and his friend always walked on the left. But that particular day, they'd switched positions. He was on the left, his friend was on the right. And that was the day his friend was killed by a sniper's bullet. And so for 40 years, this veteran had terrible flashbacks. He had nightmares. He had all the symptoms of PTSD. Yeah. And when he then thought about this in a therapy session with a therapist, with a psychologist colleague of mine, he talked about this terrible event, but he did the acupressure at the same time. He was applying acupressure, having people actually tap on these acupressure points to stimulate them. When he did the tapping as well as the telling of the story, his level of triggering went way down, and he had this epiphany. He suddenly said, I just realized just the way I wish I had died in his place, yes, he would have wanted to die for me. And suddenly, he had that, we call it a reframe, a cognitive shift in psychology. He had a huge shift in the frame through which he saw the event. And that reframe changed his life. He no longer had that guilt. His psychological symptoms went away. His physical symptoms resolved. Veterans often tell us after EFT, they start to sleep better, they digest better, all kinds of other things come into balance. So EFT has you think about the bad stuff and do the acupressure at the same time. Mm-hmm. And that makes all the difference when you combine those two ingredients.
And so EFT stands for?
Emotional Freedom Techniques. There are actually 48 techniques that we teach in our live classes and online, and tapping is 5 or 6 of those. We have a whole raft of techniques. Once we're dealing with really bad traumatic events, once we're dealing with stuff you don't remember, once we're dealing with pain and physical symptoms, we have several techniques for dealing with physical sensations where you feel bad in your body, you can't quite put your finger in it. So there are a lot of specialized techniques, but the basic technique is acupressure while thinking about the bad stuff.
I think this is absolutely phenomenal because, as we know, a lot of times military are sort of guinea pigs with a lot of things going on in the medical industry. And to find success with that means that people who are exposed to other traumas in other walks of life are going to be able to have the same type of results. And this is absolutely huge, because what I have found is that while one person may see something as a trauma, somebody else may not. And what that person may see as not a trauma really is.
Yes.
And so there's very, very interesting levels when it comes to trauma. There's also different internal responses to that. Some people will feel a stressor, some people will have anxiety, some people will develop general anxiety disorder, and some people will have PTSD and a host of a number of other issues. So what is very, very profound about this approach is that it is something that you don't have to take internally.
Right.
So it does affect you internally, because it's a direct combat to things that are happening psychologically, and then the physiological responses to them. So I find this absolutely profound. And from my research as well, not only can you have someone who administers EFT do that, there are ways to do that on yourself in the meantime. How does that work?
Just to back up a little bit, what you said was really important there, that there's no such thing as a certain class of events that results in trauma. Some people will go through war, will go through terrible experiences, and they won't have trauma. They're what we call resilient. They have a high degree of resiliency. Other people will have minor things happen to them, comparatively minor, and they'll be devastated about that. I've done quite a bit of biological research, and we're now moving much more into biological research since we've done so much psychological research. Mm-hmm. And just for example, one man I measured his cortisol levels, and he was in a clinical trial I was doing where we were comparing EFT to talk therapy. And we had him fill out all of these psychological tests, also gave him a cortisol test, and then he talked about the key trauma of his life. And it had been when his girlfriend had left him, and it had been 7 years before. And when he described how she'd left him, eventually she'd got on a plane and flown away, and he watched the plane take off, and he felt this devastation and this loss. And that happened 7 years before, but he was crying as he told it. So again, most people would get over a loss like that. He didn't have resiliency. He didn't get over it. Other people will have terrible things happen, and they won't. We measured his cortisol level after he happened to be randomized into the talk therapy group. So he got talk therapy, and he had a rise in cortisol of over 40% as he told his story and as he had the session. So even though he was getting therapy, he had a big rise in his cortisol level. Then a week later, we got him back in the lab, and he told the same story. We did another therapy session with a different therapist, told all the same stories, measured his cortisol before and after. And that second time, the big difference was he was tapping. He was doing the acupressure, telling the same story, crying, being upset. And his emotional distress went way down, but his cortisol dropped almost 50% in the course of that 1 hour of tapping. So it produces a big shift in internal stress hormones as well. So it's not what happens to you, it's how you perceive what happens to you, as whether it's traumatic or not. So that's the key thing to look at there, and then see how it's affecting you internally. Some people may go through horrendous events, they have high resiliency, it leaves them psychologically unscathed, they get over it. Other people have comparatively minor events, and they bear those psychological scars for life. I was talking to a colleague this morning on one of my coaching calls. We do a lot of live coaching programs as well as live in-person workshops. And one of my colleagues was saying that his mother was telling him on Mother's Day, which just happened, his mother's 90 years old, and she was talking about an event that happened to her when she was 16 years old, and she was crying as she talked about this event. And he said, I've heard that story 100 times before. She always cries. She's still traumatized by the event. Now, she's 90 years old. The event happened 74 years ago. She doesn't do any acupressure, doesn't actually do the therapy methods he teaches. But even though it happened all those years ago, she's still psychologically affected by it and physiologically as well. So it's really important to look at your level of resiliency and how you can raise that as high as possible.
I agree with you. And whatever somebody perceives for them, that is true to them. And they have those emotions, and those are all valid. It's valid to that person for whatever reason that it is triggering that type of a response for them. The unfortunate part about these things is when someone is not able to overcome them, and they
Yes.
carry that on for so many years, because it affects their work relationships, relationships with interpersonal, whether it's spousal, children. There's barriers and walls that people put up when they're fearful of something that comes so close to home.
Yes.
And so they do that. And unfortunately, it's really causing a hindrance in a number of ways. And so if someone is now at a point where they've said, I really need to work through this, because I know what I'm feeling every time I talk about it, or when I think about it, or when someone brings that subject up, or even when I'm driving by something and that trigger is there.
Yes.
So what is the first step in taking hold of this and utilizing EFT?
That's a good question. And Rebecca, in my books and our online courses, we always have what's called a quick start guide. Even in my books, before I even do chapter 1, I have an introduction. We have a quick start guide. And we have people just experience EFT because it is a somatic feeling in your body. So when you talk about a traumatizing event, a bad thing that happened in your life, usually you feel a rise in tension. You literally feel your cortisol level, your adrenaline level going up. And so what we do is we get people to feel the shift in their body. So we have them talk and describe what happened, the bad stuff that happened in their lives, but we get them tapping right away in the first 5 minutes. Often I do grand rounds where I'm speaking to a group of doctors, group of nurses, group of psychotherapists. I'm in a hospital. I've done EFT places like Fort Hood in Texas, huge military base.
Yes.
And what I do is I get people tapping in the first 10, 20 minutes, because when you feel that stress release in your body, when you feel that lowering of those stress hormones, it is a somatic signal that you're getting better. So the first thing we do is give people an experience of it. We don't try and convince them that it works. If you try and talk at the level of the head, you can do that for a long time. If you move to the level of the body can really grasp those safety signals very quickly. And when you tap, you just start to feel safe, you start to feel good. Your hormones start changing, your neurotransmitters start changing, your whole nervous system works differently. When we do put people into EEG machines or MRI machines and do brain scans of their brain activity, all of the emotional parts of the brain, the fearful parts, the anxious parts, just calm way down as soon as they start tapping. So the first thing to do is experience it and feel it in your body, because then it's not a matter of debate, it's a matter of a felt sense it's working for you.
And that's very important to be able to identify. And so if someone were starting to wonder what's going on, usually they'll automatically assume they're under stress, anxiety, or getting ready to have some kind of a post-traumatic stress episode. And that feeling is the feeling of our flight and fight response.
Yes.
And so that's when we can begin to recognize that there's something going on, and paying attention to those types of physical symptoms are very, very important. And I think if they're able to do that and then utilize the approach that you're sharing, it's able to come a little bit easier than trying to correlate, okay, do I need to do this first or do I need to do that? Yes. But if you have someone with you that is trained, such as yourself, then that person is going to guide you through and walk you through how that is going to go for that particular session. Now, do you do this online as well?
Oh yeah, we do it online. I have a free mini manual which will tell everyone how to get on this call. We have over 5,000 stories on our website of people who've used EFT for everything from marital strife to PTSD to sports performance. And so we have all of that. What we train people to do is when you feel that fight or flight response. Now, your ancestors 100,000 years ago, when you felt fight or flight, it was time to fight or flee. It was a real signal. There were all these predators. There were different tribes competing for scarce resources. So that fight or flight response was a brilliant response when we needed it 100,000 years ago, 400,000 years ago, over the course of evolutionary history. Nowadays, it's not. That
Right.
fight or flight response is killing us. High cortisol, high adrenaline are corrosive in our bodies if we let stress go ahead unchecked. Now, fight or flight is a signal to tap. Fight or flight is a signal to meditate, take a walk in nature, do anything other than respond to it. Because if you respond to it, what we're realizing now with neural plasticity is that those neural pathways in your brain are reinforced the more you respond. So if you're an angry person, you're getting angry, you then keep on getting angry, then you're reinforcing that neural pathway in your brain. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You get more adept at feeling angry. And when you develop the skill of recognizing the fight or flight syndrome and feeling that kind of urgency, just for example, say you are at work and one of your colleagues says something that really triggers you, and you feel that sense of, I got to justify myself, I got to defend myself. That feeling of urgency, that is what's happening when cortisol is rising in your body. So you learn to reinterpret that signal not as, I need to open my mouth and start blabbing over here. That's actually a signal to not open your mouth and start blabbing, because what you're going to say then under stress is not going to be very wise or intelligent. Instead, you learn not to say those things. Same thing with your child, your parent with Alzheimer's, your spouse. When your spouse says that thing that annoys you, and that's why we marry them, we marry the people who annoy us the most usually, so we can get over all of our childhood wounding. And so rather than reenacting all that stuff, you feel that need to say the thing to your spouse, to justify yourself, to defend yourself, to set the record straight, whatever it might be. And what we teach in our relationship skills class is when you feel that sensation of needing to, I need to say this thing, that is the psychological signal that your cortisol level is up. When your cortisol level goes up, all kinds of things happen in your brain. And the main thing that happens is your prefrontal cortex, your smart thinking executive brain, shuts off in about 14 seconds. I have a blood flow movie I show doctors at conferences, and it's a little movie, 14 seconds long, of capillaries running through human tissue. And when people get stressed, those capillaries carrying blood to their prefrontal cortex, their brain, those capillaries go from that big to that big in about 14 seconds. So within 14 seconds of you having a stressful interaction with somebody at work, somebody at home, all of the blood drains from your prefrontal cortex. You just can't think. That's why we say tap, because you can't remember any of the skills you learned. You went to a therapist, you learned nonviolent communication, you learned active listening, learned all these wonderful skills sitting there in the prefrontal cortex, which when you're upset is totally shut down. And you don't have access to all of that skill. So that's why it's so important when you're under stress, you feel that need to justify yourself, need to defend yourself, need to say that thing to your spouse or your child. All it is a rise in cortisol. And if you don't blab, if you don't open your mouth and say that stupid thing, then in about 14 seconds or 5 minutes the most, your cortisol level will go down, the blood flow will return to your forebrain, and you'll say something wise and effective in that situation. So we train people to reinterpret that stress trigger as a signal to tap, to meditate, do anything other than talk.
I love it. I think that is absolutely fantastic. So you offer workshops. You can do this online or then near you as well. The other thing is you have a new book.
Yes. I have a book coming out next year called Mind to Matter, The Surprising Science of How Our Brain Creates Material Reality. And it's packed with amazing scientific studies showing that as our thoughts go, so our material reality goes. And so it's about all the science of this. It's also full of stories of people who had absolutely uncanny experiences of thoughts to things. And so if people are able to not react emotionally, if they're able to master the reactivity and think creatively, think effectively, they wind up creating very different material reality to if they're just pushed around by their emotions all the time. So that's the big thing happening next year. This year, I'm really focused still on teaching. I train people at all the big teaching institutions all over the US, Essel Institute, Omega Institute, Kripalu, New York Open Center. I do a circuit training people in energy psychology in all of these places. And so we have online courses, we have in-person courses, and the main commonality here, Rebecca, is to help people reduce their stress. So we can teach people not to act out their stress. They will have far more successful and happier lives. And it's just wonderful to work with people and see physical pains going away, psychological issues going away. On average, the reduction in our studies in physical pain is 68%. On average,
huge.
It's huge. On average, people's cravings for sugar, sweets, chocolate, all of those things when they tap is 83%. And again, this has been shown in clinical trial after clinical trial. So tapping works for anything that causes you anxiety or stresses you. And it's wonderful to do this work and see people just shift their entire lives.
I think that is absolutely amazing. I want to touch on something that you said in that people's thoughts, the intrusive thoughts. Some people don't realize that some of the thoughts they're having is part of anxiety and it's normal. And so they get really afraid to share with somebody what's going on. And so they become secluded or they don't want to seek help. And with this method, there really is no stigma around this. You can express whatever issue it is. I love it.
Yes. In fact, we have a program, a nonprofit program called the Veterans Stress Project. And over the last 10 years, we've worked with over 18,000 veterans with PTSD and their family members and helped them recover. We've done several clinical trials. We've had volunteer teams go into war-torn areas and work with people there. And we have a wonderful online tool there called BattleTap. Many of these veterans won't go into a hospital, won't seek psychiatric treatment for all kinds of reasons, don't want to talk about stuff, but they can go on BattleTap and they can just do EFT. It's like a virtual therapist, but they can go and do EFT there right on the Veterans Stress Project website. So we have a whole bunch of resources, both in our trainings, also in our nonprofit program.
I think that's absolutely phenomenal. I also want to share with the audience that you were a reviewer in APA's mental health mobile app. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, and that's a wonderful series of resources that people can use for trauma. And we're very involved with the American Psychological Association. The American Psychological Association has guidelines for research, and they've been useful in showing that EFT is evidence-based. And so many psychologists use EFT. Now, again, I don't want to paint a picture that the whole world embraces these alternative methods. There's a lot of entrenched opposition to them as well. So I still get skepticism and we still get hostility sometimes for them. Sure. But, really tapping on acupressure points can't do you a lot of harm. And the research shows that it can do you a lot of good.
Well, I think they're finding that alternative methods of healing are very successful. And so a lot of people are turning to acupuncture and acupressure to address those. So they're finding that the many years of Chinese medicine that has been proven to work is something that is beginning to become integrated with our medical professionals in the Western world, which I think is phenomenal. So I think right now with what you're doing, this is the right time. And I don't think many people are nearly as opposed as they may have been 15 years ago.
True,
so
yes.
There's a lot going on. People are frustrated. They look at commercials on TV and it will say, hey, you can have this particular medication administered to you and it's going to address you're not shaking anymore. But here's the side effects.
Yes,
the list
right. Yes,
is huge.
Absolutely. Yeah, and some drugs, for example, there's a concept in medicine called number needed to treat and number needed to harm. And the number needed to treat is how many people you have to treat, have to take the pill before one person benefits. You know what that number is for Lipitor? that for Lipitor, the number is 99. 99 people have to take Lipitor for one person to benefit. Many of them have a number needed to harm that's much worse than their number needed to treat. Many drugs, there's one anti-anxiety drug, and of every 12 people who take it, one person benefits. But of every 12 people who take it, 2 people are harmed by the drug. So you really have to look at these numbers very carefully. One of the things that researchers have done over the last year is publish meta-analyses of EFT for anxiety, for depression, for PTSD. And these show huge effects of treatment. They then compare the effects of EFT treatment for PTSD, anxiety, and depression to talk therapy and to pharmacology. And they find that in all the meta-analyses done so far, that the treatment effects of EFT are much greater than either regular talk therapy without tapping or taking drugs. Now, that doesn't mean that you'll never need a drug again.
Sure.
If people have serious conditions, then they need drugs. If they have bacterial infections, they need antibiotics. It's not like you're never going to take another drug ever, but you want to take drugs appropriately. So treat things that are medical with medical means, but treat things that are emotional with emotional means like EFT.
I have personal knowledge of someone that has utilized EFT from a PTSD standpoint as a law enforcement officer. And that's an area that is not often addressed. Our law enforcement and our firefighters and those in the hospitals, they just don't. And there's many reasons for that, much like the military. But nonetheless, this person had a situation where they went on a call and it was very traumatic, and over time it was just devastating. And the agency that the officer was working for had that available, and it was said that once the treatment was done, that was it. No more experience of that trauma there. It was as though the negativity and the overwhelming feelings and the anxiety that was produced by that and everything else that was encompassed now became just like any other incident. It could be recognized in the brain, but the response was absolutely like any other normal event that happened in their life.
Yes. And so they still remember the bad stuff, but it no longer carries a big emotional charge. You still might remember bad things that happened. And there's one story that really gave me chills. It's on our website, of a woman who was an ambulance driver. She was an EMT, and she developed such severe PTSD that she became psychologically unfit to work. And she wasn't even 30 years old, and she was on disability for PTSD. So terrible, terrible trauma. And when she began working with a therapist, after several sessions, she said to the therapist, "I'm going to tell you something that I've never told anyone before in my whole life." She told the story about how when she was 5 years old and first going to school, first year in school, she used to have to walk to school along this path alongside a river. And so every day she'd walk to school, walk back from school alongside the river. And one day walking to school, there was a 9-year-old boy who was on the path as well. And out of the blue, with no provocation, he began to hit her, began to punch her. And so she was trying to fend him off and pushing him away, but he kept going after her, and so she kicked him. And when she kicked him, he fell and slid down the bank into the river. And then she described how she saw him sink under the water and come to the surface. He was flailing around, sank again, came to the surface again, flailing around more weakly, and then sank for good. And so for years, she had this traumatic experience in her mind, never told anyone about it, and then was at 29, was disabled with PTSD. Mm-hmm. So again, often people with PTSD in their adult lives have traumas in their childhoods, which trigger those and make them less resilient. And so this EMT then tapped with a therapist on all the different parts of that terrible childhood trauma. And after, she couldn't even name it. She couldn't even say the words initially. She would call it the incident. And then after they'd worked on all the parts of the incident for a few sessions, the ambulance driver this client was telling her therapist about the problem. And she said, I remember the day of the accident so clearly. And the therapist said, "What did you call it?" And the woman said, "What? It was an accident. They called it the accident." And the therapist said, "Well, you've always been calling it the incident." And that flip in her mind, we call it a cognitive shift in therapy, was decisive. The woman recovered completely. All her PTSD symptoms went away. She was able to resume a productive life. It completely turned her life around. So it's amazing what these therapies can do. We don't have to suffer under that burden of PTSD. We can go and clean up our childhood. We then become resilient so we can really take on the challenges of today. So it's great, whatever your stresses are, if you're in a career that's high stress, even if you're a career that's low stress, it's really worthwhile. But certainly if you're a therapist, if you're a helping professional, if you're in law enforcement, if you're in the military, it is so important not to carry that burden of stress with you through your life. Use EFT, drop all that bad stuff, and live your full potential.
Absolutely. I want to give our audience an opportunity to be able to have access to your books, to your workshops, and other things that you are doing, and the places that you go on location, and to see and talk to you live at these different venues that you go to. If you would please share your contact information and how they can get a hold of you.
Sure, Rebecca, I'd love to. And the best way to do it is just by going to my website, dawsongift.com. At dawsongift.com, you can download a free copy of the EFT mini manual, which will have you doing EFT in a few minutes. There's a one-page sheet in the back giving you the instructions in brief, as well as the core chapter from the full EFT manual is in there as well. So dawsongift.com is the place where you get the mini manual. And it's just my name, Dawson, D-A-W-S-O-N, gift, G-I-F-T.com. But there's also instructions there for a simple meditation method. There's the schedule of where I'm speaking and teaching, and access to all of our certified practitioners. So all of that stuff, all those goodies are at dawsongift.com. And I really encourage you to go to dawsongift.com, download the mini manual, and then try it one time. That's all it took. I was a skeptic, many years ago. I didn't believe in all this stuff. I did it one time and I was stressed one day and it was like, whoa, this stuff really works.
I absolutely love it. And I want to thank you for being on the show today and sharing this incredible opportunity for those that are experiencing trauma, a way for them to move forward and have happy and healthy lives. I want to thank you so very much.
Rebecca, what a joy. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for the work you do.
Oh, thank you. And I want to thank you for watching today. We hope that you will find that this is something that's going to be absolutely significant in assisting you overcome any trauma that you've had or are carrying and haven't been able to move beyond, and that you will also share that with friends, family, colleagues, and anyone that may need some assistance, even if they haven't recognized it themselves or haven't been ready to address it. There is hope out there, and it's going to be an incredible difference. And it's almost immediate, as you've heard here. And so can you imagine what your life, if you're dealing with something that has been so challenging, that you could wake up the next day and start feeling normal again. Thank you for watching, and we will see you again here on Rebecca Sounds Reveille.